Welcome everyone to this afternoon's Boston Book Festival and Koget Institute for the Humanities panel on After Nature Writing, New Approaches to Writing About the Environment. It's my pleasure to host this afternoon's event. My name is Bathsheba Demuth, and I'm a professor of environment and society and history at Brown University, and also do a variety of different kinds of environmental storytelling and writing out in the world. And it's my pleasure to gather together the four other panelists that are joining me this afternoon. I'm going to introduce each of the other four panelists briefly, but I also want to mention before we get going that there's a Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions for the panel as a whole or any of us in particular, as we're going along, please enter those into the question and answer. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And after myself and the panelists discuss a couple of general questions to get us going, we're very happy to turn to what all of you in the audience are interested in hearing from us today. So please use the Q&A. It's my pleasure from the top to introduce Tony C. Perry, is curator of environmental history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. He specializes in African American history, as well as early American environmental history. And before coming to the Smithsonian, he was a professor at the University of Virginia in the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. He researches the environmental history of American slavery and how this history has informed broader issues around race and the environment. And his forthcoming and extremely exciting book focuses on enslaved people's relationships to the environment and how they leverage this relationship to reckon with being enslaved in early America. He also works on a digital archive project that documents the perils and promise of water in African American life from the period of slavery to the present. And I believe that that will also be available for us in book form some point in the future. So welcome, Tony. Next, I'd like to introduce Kerri Arsenault, who's book review editor at Orion magazine, a teacher, book critic, and author of the critically acclaimed Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains, which won the Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Leonard Prize. Her work has appeared in Freeman's, the Boston Globe, Down East, the Paris Review Daily, the New York Review of Books, Air Mail, and the Washington Post. Next, I'll introduce Joan Naviyuk Kane, an Naviyuk poet and author of 8 collections of poetry and prose, for which she has received a Guggenheim and other honors. She teaches in the Department of English at Harvard, is a lecturer in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, and the Department of English at Tufts University, and MFA faculty at the Institute of American Indian Arts. She was a 2021 Practitioner Fellow at the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University, and the 2021 Mary Rout Endowed Chair of Creative Writing and Journalism at Scripps College. And last but certainly not least, Kate Brown is the Thomas M. Seibel Distinguished Professor in the History of Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is the author of several prize-winning histories, including Plutopia, Nuclear Families, Atomic Cities, and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters. And her latest book, Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future, is translated into 9 languages, won the Marshall Schulman and Reginald Zelnick Prizes for the best book in East European history, plus the silver medal Laura Shannon Book Prize. And Manuals for Survival was also a finalist for the 2020 National Book Critics Circle Award, the Pushkin House Award, and others. So you can tell why I'm very excited to be amongst this extremely distinguished company this afternoon. It's really kind of a dream team. So thank you all for joining me. So I have just sort of 3 general questions to get us started thinking together. And particularly on this topic of environmental writing or environmental storytelling, environmental poetry, and thinking about it kind of in the 21st century, where that fits within other kinds of genres or subjects of writing, particularly since authors like Amitav Ghosh and Camille Dungy have argued that all writing now is environmental writing, or perhaps all writing should be environmental writing, or should kind of strive in that direction. And so I wondered if all of you think of this as being true of your work, or should it be true? Is that too narrow a definition of what the environment is, too capacious? How do you approach that question in your work?
I was thinking about Amitav Ghosh's discussion of novels and how there is no sort of Anthropocene novel. And he was talking about how novels are really focused on the anthros, on humans and their psychological interiors. And as they move through their world, he points out, and once he pointed this out, it really struck me, novels are really, selling things to us. They're promoting, fashion and interior design and architecture. And I myself have had that sense of, I go to some foreign city and I'm walking down the street and a soundtrack pops up. And I too am part of that, whatever that is, that makes you feel somehow more alive through your consumption of things. And he's saying, it's time to shift our focus onto different kinds of terrains and different kinds of people and different kinds of human actions that aren't so much about consumption. And I feel like I've done that increasingly in my writing career. I was really focused on toxins, as I wrote 2 books on nuclear histories and how to follow the toxins, how to follow them through landscapes and into human bodies, and what kind of changes does that bring about in our worlds. And now I've been following plants. I've put plants in the center of my focus, especially plants in cities where we don't normally expect them to be. And having done that, I suddenly see all kinds of new things that historically I had never understood to have occurred. And so I don't think that all writing is environmental writing, but I do think now all writing should be environmental writing, that we should expand the organisms and the species that we fixate on in our writing. It's kind of a long answer, I apologize.
That's so interesting. Plants in cities. I want to talk more about that. But I just wrote a book about that underscores, I think, how we define our landscapes, but also how our landscapes define us. So I never thought this was actually a question or an argument to be made. And I hadn't read what Camille or Amitav wrote on that idea, but I just think our cultural, our sociological, our economical and emotional landscapes they're all linked to our physical landscapes. I don't know how we can delink our lives from the land that bears us out. Like, for instance, Maine, which was the topic of my book. It's a state that's 90% forested, right? A landscape that contributes to the cultural values of the people that live there, like what they do for pleasure. They hike, they ski, they fish, they boat. And it's also their social structures, like in the thick Maine woods, which is about 10 million unpopulated acres in Maine, where basically nobody lives. There are sort of private lands amid public parcels of land and vice versa. So there's like all these little archipelagos. So that kind of defines their social structure. And there's basically no governance there as like normal state governance. So they're detached, but related to the state of Maine, sort of like West Bank and Gaza, right? And then the ownership changes frequently. So it's hard to know who owns what. Anyway, that's to say that's the social structures are defined by those woods too. And then also, it doesn't even mean, it's also questions who owns the woods, right? In Maine, it's a really complicated structure about paper companies, individuals like Roxanne Quimby, who is the owner of Burt's Bees. And then I don't know if you know, but Yale is one of the largest landowners of the Maine woods for reasons undetermined. And then there's the economics of the land, where Maine has always been a paper plantation, if you ask me. And if you ask Ralph Nader, who wrote a book called The Paper Plantation of Maine, of trees and people. And that industry, the paper industry, has wrecked the very forests and bodies of water that are part of the identity of Mainers that I just described. So that's been happening for over 100 years. So I'm not sure this is a new concept, but to enumerate it might be, and to go further afield, like the civil war in Syria, which emerged from a drought and food insecurity, but has massive political and cultural consequences, as well as global migrations. And why was there a drought? Climate change. Anyway, that's long story long.
At the very mention of Maine, my ears kind of perk up. I did my undergraduate study at Bowdoin College, and it was really during that time that my own kind of sense and orientation as it concerns the environment really began to emerge. And so Maine figures informatively in kind of thinking about my own thinking about the environment, people's relationship to it. But to speak to this question of this entanglement, I think the entanglement between people and their environments, between people and the landscape. I think one of the things that I found striking in a lot of the literature I was engaging that falls under the umbrella of slavery studies was the extent to which not many people at all were really focusing on foregrounding the environment, elements of the environment, anything in these kind of narratives. Typically, traditionally, these narratives are about people. And many would say, I think I might join them, rightfully so, as we think about the institution of American slavery. And of course, you have those shifts within history, initial focus on slaveholders, a kind of top-down perspective, and then with the advent of social history and kind of thinking about the ground up. But what I found in my reading of this literature was that so much of the environment is there and is present and is being discussed by scholars of the history of slavery, even if it's not a leading focus of this work. And so when I began reading for the environment, that writing that on its surface really wasn't about the environment really became in many ways environmental history, in large part because of the degree to which the environment informed what was the institution of slavery, enslaved people's everyday lives, how the kind of slaveholding logic as it related to resources and generating capital, largely agriculturally, but of course industrially and otherwise. And so in that sense, engaging this literature on the history of slavery became environmental writing in ways that figured prominently in my own kind of, as I found my way in terms of writing about the environment on the landscape of slavery.
To follow perhaps a through line in this first question, or at least in the answers so far, I'm thinking about a project that I'm working on with the visual artist Justin Levesque. We're hoping to get this going for 2022, but thinking through my relationship to the Arctic, a place that I haven't been to now for several years. I haven't been back to Alaska, but thinking about the history, particularly in the northeastern United States, of accessing the Arctic, or the wildness of the Arctic and the subarctic through Maine in particular, and thinking about how now as Indigenous writers increasingly are welcome to publish and discuss and center work that illuminates a lot of the social aspects and cultural aspects of indigeneity. I'm thinking about the Inupiaq concept of sila, or the weather, the environment, the external world, and also the relationship of that word sila to consciousness. And so thinking about the different ways in which writers in various positionalities are finding their way to the designation of environmental writing, but also really thinking about what it means to deprivilege certain perspectives and certain aspects of, essentially not increasing the troublesome rhetoric of climate change and racialized perspectives on climate change when it comes to being engulfed in white tears, as well as the problems essentially of whiteness when it comes to the impact of race on the environment and climate as well.
I think actually when I was putting this panel together, in some ways, one of the things that drew me to thinking of all of your work kind of in dialogue is that while you are all authors for whom the environment is a piece of what you write in different ways, it's not it's not kind of cordoned off and held separate in the way that I think there's an older tradition of sort of quote nature writing, where usually from the perspective of a kind of white male protagonist, you get this sort of look from the mountaintop and you're supposed to feel awe or kind of a set of very prescribed, very middle-class emotions about a landscape that's uninhabited, that's ahistorical, that doesn't have a lot of kind of embodied experience to it, except when you kind of access it for recreation. And that the ways in which the environment work in all of your very different kind of genres and ways of approaching writing is that it is just a piece of life. And that's not a just in a way, meaning that it's like lessened. It's actually bringing it in a way that I think, I mean, I still have this sort of ongoing frustration when you open the New York Times and somehow stories about the quote environment end up in a different part of the newspaper than stories about economics or politics, when in fact, they're far more intertwined in the ways that all of your work makes really clear. So thank you for those.
And the way your work makes very clear too. I just want to point that out.
Thank you, Kerri. So I think something that I have noticed over the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years is that the kind of pace and tone of writing about the environment, and particularly writing about climate change, feels like it has ticked up. The coverage has become more robust in a certain way, at least that it's being covered more reliably. But I also have the sense every time I open a story that's about, about wildfires, if it's about the Arctic, goodness, the narratives there feel like they all follow the same arc. Even about kind of climate politics in general, it feels like there's kind of a set, either we're telling a story in which there's kind of a technocratic exit or a solution, and that's the focus, or it's a story of kind of loss and despair, or probably the white tears that Joan was talking about to some degree. And actually, I was thinking about the kind of roteness of some of these narratives when I was reading Joan's most recent book, Dark Traffic, which I commend all of you to go find a copy of. That there's so much that's left out of the kind of either technocratic solutions kind of way of thinking about the environment, or one that simply is kind of reporting the latest, most terrible piece of kind of a headline making news. So I was wondering about how all of you think about writing that does more than that, right? That reveals or engages or activates or shows readers the kind of complexity and particularity of environmental issues without falling into those kind of formulaic narratives of decline or of kind of technocratic hope. Or maybe you don't think about it at all.
I think about it all the time, actually. I think to go off what you just said, I think the trick is to sort of summon the human heart without trafficking in those preconceived emotions that often environmental stories want to do, or some of them, like you said about the loss, the ones of loss, or the ones that are solution based, or even those alarmist ones. They're going towards a sentimentality instead of a sentiment. And I would encourage the latter, to go towards a sentiment without the sentimentality, whatever that is. So, when I read, I get so many books as a book critic, books that have happy endings, which everybody wants happy, hopeful endings. But I feel like there's a deficit in that, because it makes us believe that everything's done and there's nothing left to do. And the same with the solution-based books. It feels like the same thing, we've already come up with some answers and we just, read the book and we do the thing. But I think, like I said, to get to the heart of the storytelling, which is different than environmental writing, I consider those different, storytelling and writing. And I think telling the story is really the crux of what you're even saying. It's just that here, all of our writers on this panel tell stories instead of just deliver information, right? We put it in a context. And I think part of that is the human heart is as complex as the environment. And I think putting those in parallel somehow without, like, oh, everybody's dying of cancer, that's so sad, or koala bears are dying in the forest fires, I'm so sad, like tell a story that can address those issues without going directly at them like that. That's one way. I have more, but I'll let other people talk.
I agree with you, Kerri, that a lot of these stories breed passivity. Whether it's a story of total destruction, there's nothing left to do, it's too late, there's loss. Or it's a technocratic fix, well, the experts have it. And both of those narratives, it strikes me, are narratives that are told from that mountaintop that Bathsheba was just talking about. They're expert voices talking to you, the simpleton that doesn't know much about your environment or how things work and how bad things are. And I think that the real beauty of the people in this panel is that you all, and I try to too, seek out people who are not in that category of the expert, but have tons and nuanced knowledge of the precisely the specific environments that they live in. Not some big general, knowledge of the planet. And maybe that's our problem with the way we talk about climate change and also the Anthropocene, is that the scale is always planetary, which means that the human individual or community of people have no field of action. Who acts other than a world leader or, a super duper scientist, who acts on a planetary scale? We can only act in our local scale. So in my Manual for Survival book, I was looking for these people who were, like somebody who worked in a dairy and noticed that the milk was radioactive, or somebody who was a nurse in a small village and noticed that the kids were suddenly all sick, and especially the kids who lived in one part of town and not the other. And they start to do their own research and their own people's epidemiology, and they really make a difference. They can really change. They can save lives. They can save environments. And I feel like those are the stories we need to hear more about. They both talk about the problem, the loss, without sort of covering it up, but they also talk about human action in a positive sense, not just in a destructive sense.
What I heard you say, and I know Bathsheba does this in her book too, is she sort of captures a community voice and thinks more polyphonically about how stories are told, like Alexievich does too. That and those kind of stories decenter authority, which helps and gives rise to a wider view. But it doesn't. It decenters, but it doesn't devalue the center, which are the people that you were just talking about. Those people that are in it, kind of. It just keeps an eye on the center from afar. I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
I want to, maybe this is a little bit of a change in tack, but I think that I'm thinking of, as a poet, and even in my poetic nonfiction, I'm thinking that what I'm concerned with is language itself, and not just the English language as poets, invoke it and use it as a material, but also thinking about the Inupiaq language and thinking about conversations I've had with writers like Sherwin Bitsui, who, we've talked about how our languages, don't have yet some of the tropes that are present in a colonial language like English, in a language that wants to take everything and repurpose it into something that can be extracted or commodified, and thinking about how the work of poets, especially poets writing now and writing in response to the environment, or writing in conversation with it, how sometimes there are so many ways to through avoiding story and moving into image that you can present the truest or the most immediate access to not just literal landscapes, but psychological, emotional, ancestral landscapes. I think that are very different from storytelling or narrative. Just wanted to bring that into the conversation a bit.
I think that's fascinating, and on several fronts, and in such a way that I'm sure I'll continue to reflect on it, but this question of narrative and thinking about language in that way, it also, it casts slightly different light on the place and role that objects play in some of my own thinking, where I, although ultimately I'm still very much interested in matters of narrative, I what I try to do is to foreground objects and frame them as a kind of material outcome of human beings interacting with their environs, and thinking about the production and consumption of objects, the kind of scenes, if you will, that cohere around objects that become quotidian in enslaved people's everyday lives. So, for example, agricultural implements such as plows, and kind of thinking about historical scenes and landscape that then come into view immediately and peripherally when we kind of focus our gaze on objects, and the different kinds of writing that could perhaps emerge from there. It's something that's certainly in process, but what I've found is that other kinds of narratives are emerging. I'm principally interested in those that speak to enslaved people's relationship to the environment and the ways in which they leverage this relationship to reckon with the fact of their enslavement. But I'm very much interested in the some of the new or at least different avenues of thought, that kind of thinking through objects and with objects as it relates to the environment, that just kind of open up from that vantage.
I love that too. And that also makes me think of monuments, which I wrote a lot about too in my book, which is an object that is so colonial and so, you know, especially in my world, it commemorates so many of the memorials and monuments commemorate this resource extraction, but don't commemorate the consequences of that resource extraction. So I thought a lot about that in writing too.
These are all really interesting responses, and I think what Joan said about the possibilities for forms that aren't narrative, which, you know, as a historian with my feet very much in the clay of writing things that have beginnings, middles, and ends, and arcs, and a complicated history with supporting the nation state and various other baggage that comes along with being a historian who writes in English, I'm really intrigued about the potential for even such sort of resolutely narrative forms as history to potentially break those expectations by resisting the kinds of moves that we're expected to make. And it's not something I think I've ever done successfully, but it's something I think is actually really important for our field to think with, actually, because I think there is kind of an Amitav Ghosh problem of narrative expectations that can fall into writing histories that we don't have to do. Like, we have lots of options. And I actually think that my fellow historians on this panel are people who use those options. But the poets are way out ahead of us, as usual. I think I'm actually going to look at some of the audience questions now, because there's some wonderful ones coming in, and I can forestall mine forever if necessary. And I wanted to start with one that Yunji Bang wrote in asking if writing necessarily has to center on nature to be considered, quote, environmental, or can social commentary reflect on how we interact with the environment also?
This is a question I wrestled with for some time in the earlier stages of the book I'm working on. Initially, it was, or I was describing it as an environmental history of slavery, and then I stepped away from that because I realized, I realized in the writing that it was ultimately about enslaved people. And although I was focusing on their relationship to the environment, I wasn't sure, right, if it qualified as environmental history or even environmental writing, and thinking about just tensions and representations of the human and the non-human. But I realized that what I wanted to speak to, what I wanted to write about, was enslaved people's everyday lives and the extent to which the environment informed and shaped their everyday lives, and vice versa. But I've since then I've returned to this question, and I think, or I would say that I certainly cast the book as an environmental history, but one that reads this history through the lived experiences of enslaved people. And in that way, there is this kind of, there is the commentary that's there, but at the root of the commentary is really thinking about dimensions of enslaved people's lives that a few people have engaged, but not many, but that's so rich with potential, and really kind of getting at a question of enslaved people's humanity and the extent to which many enslaved peoples are able to enact and lay claim to aspects of their humanity through engaging the non-human. So with that, although my focus is more so, I'm not even sure if even kind of quantifying it in that way is fair, but I really had to spend time thinking about this question of privileging the human in the space of writing about the environment.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'm just going to respond very quickly to, I don't think that I started a book about a family, and it necessarily paralleled the entire history, environmental history of the United States. So I couldn't ignore that. And it still became about both. But I think the word commentary is what troubles me, is like, I don't think that giving answers is the right way to write environmental stories. I think asking questions is the better way. And I think that all these writers do that. They ask questions. That's all.
My hope has always been that environmental writing no longer sits in its own ghetto, that it becomes incorporated into all the questions that historians and all kinds of scholars and writers ask, that, as you know, you're interested in social relations, you're interested in what happened in a war in a particular place, but to include in that of the panorama that you're looking at is to include environmental factors will only make that story richer, and probably get you to more nuanced and I don't want to say truer answers, but answers that really reflect more the experience of people on the ground.
I think I just want to jump in with an a thought that when I am often, as I often am, homesick for the Arctic and the subarctic, I think of not necessarily the people. Yes, I miss my family. I miss the kinship networks that have allowed Enraptured people to survive in the Arctic for millennia. But I'm also thinking about our relationship to, of course, the non-human, right? To the animals, marine mammals, and the other forms of life, plant life that sustain a complex ecosystem. And actually, it's not so much thinking about the function of the social aspect of the environment, but really thinking about how what I miss is a sense of perspective that actually an absence of the social, that having just a relationship with life and life cycles in the Arctic is especially important and grounding. And thinking too, to the idea that you know, the place of the human in the environment is so small, and that there are so many other factors to consider.
I'm going to try to combine two questions that I think are moving in similar directions that have just come through. One is asking, kind of in response to something that Kate brought up about the ways in which you can look to people who aren't experts, right? And Julianne Warren asks, you know, it sounds like the people that Kate's actually talking about are experts, and is this kind of a failure or an issue in terms of who is designated as an expert, and how does that kind of combine with our ideas of who is able to desire a particular future, right? That the kind of imagination of the future comes from who we designate as the experts to do so, which is, I think, a similar question to what Patrick Lim is asking about kind of incorporating different kinds of ideas of the future in our imaginations. Patrick quotes Catherine Hayward in saying that, quote, "One of the most important things that we are lacking right now is a vision of a better future that we can head towards, as opposed to only an apocalyptic future that we can avoid." And so both of these questions seem like they're tangling with different issues, and I'm curious as to how that future orientation and who gets to speak it emerges in your work.
I guess the experts I was thinking about, you're absolutely right, we're experts. Though they didn't have a high school degree and they worked in a wool factory cleaning shit and mud off of wool. But they're the ones who told me, you know, sure, we got this wool clean, but did you ever inquire about where that the waste flowing from the factory was going? And I said, no. And they said, well, go ask, because it went into the drinking water reservoir. And sure enough, they were right. And they knew a lot more than any other person with a good salary and a degree knew. And over and over again, I had that experience of people pointing the way to me who most people, most of the sort of parachuting scientists or officials that came into the terrain, when they spoke, when these villagers spoke, they were just considered hysterical and radiophobic and too ignorant to really enter a discussion with. In terms of the future, absolutely. That I'm working on a project now about urban self-provisioning. And what I'm finding out is that working class people in cities around the world in the 19th and 20th centuries took the emerging megalopolis and all the resources that were being gathered to cities that was considered waste and considered a big sanitation problem. And they used those resources to grow food. And they created new technologies to do that. And they created some of the most successful farming known to humankind, I would argue. And if we start to focus on those experts, those unsung sort of scientists, then I think we start to envision a much brighter future for ourselves. If we think about how that closes a metabolic rift, it relocalizes our food. It takes food production, which can be up to 30 to 50% of CO2 emissions, and it sort of takes that out of the equation. Then we can start to envision a brave new world, I think, a more hopeful one.
I love this question about experts, because I purposefully didn't go to any experts unless they were very specific to my town, because I felt like the other stories, sort of, if I was being a true journalist, like to get both sides of the story, I felt like the other story, the one of the industry, had been told so many times over and over and over that I basically ignored them, like they had ignored the working class town that I was from and the people in it. So I completely agree with Kate on that. And I think I also wanted to write a book that those people would read too, because it's about them. And I wanted them to be able to read it and not just preach to the choir of people who are going to agree with me on sort of cultural commentary, whoever wrote that thing, but I wanted them to read it, see themselves in it, because, and not to say, here, I'm showing you yourself. I mean, I include the large we in that book, but I am them in some ways. But also, I think having a perspective from being away helped me see better and help them understand things, that dynamic of being from a place, but not living there. Anyway, that's all to say. I think somebody else mentioned too that being more local in the focus is, I feel like, really where it can start to make, if we're talking really about environmental writing and how it's going to change things, which is sort of the undergirding our conversation, right? Like it has to start small, micro to macro instead of the other way around.
The question or the matter of expertise, I think, is important for or to my thinking on multiple fronts. But I think most immediately, when we consider really any kind of underclass, and in ways that I think has come up in this conversation thus far, thinking about the underclass, for me, this is largely, but certainly not limited to, enslaved people in early America. There's knowledge that comes by way of, and specifically environmental knowledge, of course, that comes by way of living and experience and the everyday and the mundane. But as it concerns the landscape of slavery, there's also, tremendous knowledge that comes from labor, and the kinds of labor that enslaved peoples are providing. And that is going to be true for underclasses, working classes prior to the advent, if you will, of early America. I mean, all the way through the present and across the globe. And I think this question of the matter of lived experience, everyday lived experiences, and labor, the extent to which these are entangled, but certainly represent, I think, different kinds of spheres. You also have on the landscape of slavery this bifurcation, if you will, of knowledge, where the kind of labor that enslaved people are providing becomes stigmatized, and the kind of labor that poor white farmers are doing is becoming stigmatized. So the quote unquote elites, right? So slaveholding individuals, there's a different kind of expertise that emerges there, one that's often framed at that time. And it's interesting because of the parallels to now, who might have more of an academic knowledge, let's say, of agriculture, who are more up to date on the new and the latest agricultural innovations and techniques, and are up to date with the science. And so that tension is there on this early American landscape in ways that I think casts, instructive light on some of the questions, we're engaging. And so for me, as one who's oriented more so to the past, the conversation we're having is resonates certainly.
I'm thinking of the future, I guess, with regards to this question in a couple of different ways. Thinking about my children, 11 and 13, and what what the future might look like for them in relationship to land and the sea and the sea ice, but also thinking about the kinds of observations that traditional ecological knowledge has engendered, and what happens to that, and how can we consider the future when we're still working to understand the very real impacts of recent history and the long history of colonial violence, I think, especially in the Americas, but thinking thinking about global futures is something that I don't know. I guess I just want to make space to think about the possibility that especially young people now, young Indigenous people are having difficulty seeing tomorrow, much less thinking too far into the future.
This question of, I mean, for one thing, it's hard to follow all these points because they're all, I think, coming at this question in ways that are very important and sometimes not surfaced as part of the discussion as much as maybe they should be. I think one thing that I've come to realize is that anytime that you are writing about the environment, you're writing about kind of a field of social power, right? And that part of that social power is enacted in whose expertise counts as actually being knowledge about the environment in the first place. And I think that comes up in what everyone here has said to some degree, and that the lack of ability to claim that expertise is one of the real hallmarks of the colonial violence that Joan was just speaking to, that the ways in which that's been sort of severed from the official kind of record of things and has to be reasserted really against the grain of who has the most power, which I think is a way in which all of us on this panel are thinking very differently than an older kind of environmental writing in which the environment itself was the place that was outside of social power, or just sort of outside of the social, right? Which I think, as Joan made pretty clear, has never made any sense unless you have a very particular worldview. And I think, as Tony and Kate and Kerri have made clear in very different contexts, is just not historically operational. I now have the really difficult task of trying to go through some of the extraordinarily good questions that have come in the remaining 9 minutes that we have. And I don't want to hurry anyone's response because I think deliberation is excellent. So we're probably not going to get to all of the questions. But I'm going to try to combine, again, 2 questions, one from Daria and one from Justin. Daria is asking about the role of imagination in your writing and the ways in which that is sort of useful to narrate and experience relations kind of beyond the human. And then Justin's question, which I think is related to this, about the ways in which environmental writing often is sort of encapsulated by what can be observed or measured or is tangible, and whether or not any of you see kind of supernatural or memories or kind of other kinds of ways of perceiving the world and understanding it as being operative in what you're writing.
In some of my own thinking, the supernatural environment is critical in thinking about the environment as it existed or as experienced by enslaved people. So in the different kind of iterations or forms of the environment that I focus on, the land and landscape figures prominently, weather, climate figures prominently, but then also the supernatural, this kind of the spiritual plane, the otherworldly, and in its materiality, the ways in which enslaved peoples engage the supernatural, the extent to which many enslaved people's relationship to the supernatural largely hinged on their ability to, their desire to summon power from the otherworldly to inform, to shape affairs in their everyday lives, for matters of protection, for matters of healing, for matters of being able to respond and to act back. And so the supernatural, as it existed for the enslaved figures prominently, and I think for many peoples today, the supernatural as an environment unto itself is one that is often left out of a lot of framings or definitions, but that it's altogether important.
Second that, and to sort of include Justin's point about like, well, so then where does expert knowledge and using science as a way to understand these more than human organisms we're talking about. I've been just so struck with how recent science that looks at the microbial world or the mycorrhizal world and plant intelligence and plant sentience, how much they affirm what indigenous people have been saying for a long, long time, and what has been sort of categorized as the supernatural. But it's not the supernatural. It's the, maybe supernatural is a good word. It's the extra natural. It's all the ways that outside of human perception, that communication and transference is going on. And so that, you know, we're sort of sitting here as you know, people who've grown out of the Western Academy, we're sitting here flat-footed, having to go back to indigenous knowledge and go, oh yeah, that's what they were talking about.
I look at the supernatural question in a very different light, because my book ends with a guy who believes in Bigfoot. And it's kind of funny, but at the same time, he feels like the summary of all the sort of ambiguity that he felt under the boot of environmental pollution, and a lot of sociological harm can come of that. And one of those things in lots of journals and books that I read is you can have non-traditional belief systems. That doesn't mean they're crazy or anything. It just means you have so I address the non-traditional belief systems as a result of living under that, again, that boot of ambiguity and environmental pollution.
I'm trying to connect the idea of imagination, or what the human mind or what sort of the consciousness can do in order to will survival and also thinking about, I'm really preoccupied with this question of futurity, because I think I'm thinking as well about the idea of, you know, as Keats articulated it, of negative capability, and this the role of language. One of the functions of language, when it's not reduced to sort of an information delivery system, is to step away from the irritable grasping after fact, and thinking about how you know, how engagement with the world beyond the sort of contemporary capitalistic take really allows people to think about things that can't be explained or can't be controlled. And also I think that's the question of agency that I'm interested in across everyone's work today, because I think that's something, you know, people have yet to work out, I think, and especially now at a time when rhetorics of climate change and the environment are increasingly inclusive. I think that's something I'm interested in thinking about a bit more.
So in many ways, I think that would be the ideal place to end, but I'm going to ask Thomas Belfield's question, which was also my final question, which is essentially a lightning round on what it is that you are reading now.
I'm currently reading a book that somebody's on here as an attendee, is Empire of Rubber by Greg Mittman, which is an incredible book that shows the history of America and empire and colonialism and racism and everything through tires. I'm reading that. I just read The Every by Dave Eggers, which is a sort of an atypian novel. And it sounds like a weird thing to recommend here, but I think it asks the question, is this really the kind of life we want to live in its environment with a lowercase e? And that's why I recommend it, even though it's called The Every with an uppercase E. And also this collection of essays called The Tiny Bee That Hovers at the Center of the World by David Searcy. And it's about interrogating the mystery of meaning itself, really, and through the Texas landscape that bore him out.
I'm reading Danielle Geller's Dog Flowers, which is a memoir in many ways, but it also works with archive in other ways. And also Abigail Chabot-Noy's new chapbook, which I have here, but I can't reach, so I can't remember the name of it. But I think I've been spending a lot of time with these writers in particular this semester.
I'm revisiting some classics, Dr. Zhivago, and which I love even more than ever, and Michael Polanyi's The Great Transformation, which I think is shockingly wrong.
And I'm currently reading, I'm in the middle of Alexis Wells' Ogogame's The Souls of Womenfolk, on enslaved women and religious cultures in the Low Country. So going back to this question of the supernatural as it relates to the enslaved and just the field of religion. And I recently finished Taya Miles's All That She Carried, when we're thinking about the history of enslavement as it relates to objects and even the environment. I found just, yeah, compelling.
Two of you have mentioned two books that I also have been reading, which are Greg Mittman's Empire of Rubber and Taya Miles' The Thing She Carried, which are both beautiful books. I've also been reading Xiaowei Wang's collection of essays called Blockchain Chicken Farm, which is just sort of a marvelous introduction to what agriculture and life looks like in rural and quasi-rural China right now, which is an area of the world that I'm incredibly interested in and have no particular access to at all, since I speak no Mandarin or any other useful language in that space. And I actually just finally got a copy, I don't know how it's taken me so long, of Abigail Chabot-Noy's book, How to Dress a Fish. So she can have two showings on our podcast this afternoon. And I am so sorry to all of the wonderful questions that came in the chat that we don't have time to get to. I thought they were a really wonderful compendium and probably show that we could just continue talking on this subject for another hour at least, but I would like to let everyone return to this beautiful fall afternoon. Thank you to Tony and Kerri and Joan and Kate, and thank you all for coming.